The sub-zero temperature of the biosafety cabinet radiated through the double-layered nitrile gloves, biting at the tips of Clara Vance's fingers as she adjusted the micropipette with microscale precision. Her right eyelid twitched twice. It was a localized tremor induced by 18 consecutive hours of tracking macromolecular configurations under an unyielding monochrome glare. The atmosphere inside the basement facility of Cambridge was dense. It was saturated with the low-frequency hum of high-efficiency particulate air filtration systems that droned continuously at 42 decibels. A heavy scent of industrial disinfectant mixed with the faint, sharp tang of pure nitrogen gas hung in the small room. The mixture dried the inner lining of her nasal passages until every deep breath felt brittle. Clara focused her gaze on the central stainless steel workspace, where 12 identical sterile test tubes rested securely inside an insulated aluminum rack. The overhead light-emitting diodes cast a merciless white illumination across her workspace. The bright light reflected off the metallic surfaces and created sharp, colorless microglares that burned the periphery of her retinas. Her shoulders sat rigid, locked in place by the cumulative physical strain of her research. The lingering chill of the Massachusetts winter seemed to seep directly through the concrete foundation of the research center. She slowly reached out her left arm. Her fingers curled around the cold handle of the biological incubator. Her movements were measured, rhythmic, and entirely devoid of hesitation. Clara evaluated the operational metrics on the terminal screen. Her mind systematically categorized the subtle patterns of psychological manipulation Arthur had deployed during their dinner conversation the previous evening. He had practiced his gaslighting with a polished, systematic delivery, utilizing soft tones to diminish her status. At the same time, he ensured his mother, Victoria Radcliffe, maintained supreme authority over every domestic boundary. They viewed her clinical research at Biogen as an eccentric pastime. To them, it was a minor intellectual distraction that should be dissolved immediately to satisfy the traditional expectations of their social circle. Richard Radcliffe, her brother-in-law, had been particularly vocal about the absolute superiority of Radcliffe Laboratories. He constantly dismissed her work on peptide synthesis as a redundant academic exercise. They did not possess the technical competence to comprehend the true scale of her work. This independent project represented a paradigm shift in target therapy, a proprietary sequence that remained entirely insulated from their failing commercial infrastructure. Her prenuptial agreement contained an unyielding intellectual property rider. This explicit clause locked the ownership of her individual inventions completely away from their corporate grasp. She understood the financial desperation driving their behavior. The Radcliffe family name was carrying massive structural liabilities, and they required a breakthrough asset to prevent a total market liquidation. The terminal display flashed once as Clara initiated the authorization sequence. Her fingers entered the 24-character alphanumeric administrative password without a single deviation. The conversation that had taken place in the drawing room 3 days ago echoed through her memory. It was a stiff exchange where Victoria had demanded she surrender her system access logs under the guise of family integration. Arthur had stood by the fireplace, his posture projecting an artificial neutrality while he urged her to comply with his mother's administrative directives for the sake of marital harmony. Clara had kept her voice low. Her responses remained strictly neutral as she refused to share her private network credentials. She noted the immediate somatic signs of frustration in her husband's posture. His chest had tightened, and his breathing grew shallow as he realized his domestic leverage was insufficient to break her professional boundaries. Richard had watched the interaction from the corner. His eyes tracked the movement of her personal data drive with an intensity that revealed his hidden commercial intentions. She had recognized the tactical alliance forming between them. It was an explicit agreement to extract her research by any means necessary to secure the Zurich integration contract. Clara deliberately pressed the enter key. She entered the secure network environment, where her core genetic files were protected by an encryption protocol that required direct biometric verification. The intrusion detection monitor on the secondary monitor suddenly illuminated in bright crimson, breaking the monochrome rhythm of the laboratory with a sequence of high-priority system alerts. The warning box indicated an unauthorized mirror script executing within the primary archive directory. The intruder utilized an administrative credential that had bypassed the initial firewall protection. Clara tracked the data path instantly. She recognized the specific network port that mapped directly to the residential terminal located within Richard's private study at the Radcliffe estate. The system showed that 3 gigabytes of raw sequencing data had already been copied. The transfer moved rapidly across the dedicated fiber link at 94 megabytes per second. Instead of terminating the connection, she initiated an internal trace script. The program documented the exact timestamp, the hardware address, and the specific user profile used to execute the system trespass. The file transfer icon pulsed steadily as the data was siphoned away. This provided definitive empirical proof of a deliberate corporate espionage campaign executed under the direction of her own husband's family. Clara remained entirely motionless. Her hand rested flat on the cold laminate desk while she watched the progress indicator reach 99% before the connection automatically severed itself from the network. The crimson warnings on the system interface vanished into a black log screen, leaving the room in the shadowless, artificial light of the main laboratory bay. The thermal output of the high-velocity processor pool decreased rapidly, causing the ambient temperature to drop slightly against the fabric of her protective lab coat. Through the heavy viewing pane of the laboratory door, the long, concrete utility corridors of the Cambridge complex stood completely silent. The absolute absence of movement confirmed that the night shift staff had already left the floor. No footsteps disturbed the stillness of the subterranean research level. The external security monitors showed only the steady accumulation of winter sleet against the high security fences outside. Clara stood up slowly from her chair, her gaze fixed tightly on the dark, empty space of the terminal screen before she reached for the primary power terminal on the concrete wall. The hum of the cooling fans died down into a deep, heavy quiet that filled the entire interior of the lab. This marked the absolute separation between her work and the family narrative that had tried to consume it. She turned away from the dark equipment, stepping out into the cold corridor as the automated locks engaged behind her. The heavy scent of cedarwood oil and oxidized floor wax hung in the stagnant air of the private study, coating the back of Clara Vance's throat with a dry, resinous residue. Her left palm rested flat against the cold, polished surface of the solid mahogany desk. She felt the minute vibrations caused by the winter gale throwing wet sleet against the heavy, leaded glass panes. The temperature within the perimeter of the room was kept at an uncomfortable 24 degrees Celsius by the roaring brick fireplace. The heat created a suffocating layer of dry air that caused the skin across her cheekbones to tighten. A dull, throbbing ache flared at the base of her neck. This was a direct consequence of sitting motionless in a rigid, high-backed chair under the dim orange glow of a single brass desk lamp. Outside, the darkness of the Massachusetts night completely swallowed the surrounding Radcliffe estate. Only the rhythmic, slashing sound of frozen rain broke the heavy silence of the room. Clara did not look toward the window. Her eyes remained focused entirely on the long, pale fingers of Victoria Radcliffe as they slid a thick, cream-colored document across the dark wood pattern. Her own fingers remained perfectly still. Her right hand rested over her wool skirt, maintaining a measured, rhythmic rate of breathing that prevented the slightest physical indication of vulnerability. This claustrophobic environment was the calculated center of the domestic net that Victoria and Arthur had spent the last 14 days tightening around her identity. Clara evaluated the formal text of the document before her. Her mind immediately isolated the hidden structural mechanics of the intellectual property non-disclosure overlay they had secretly inserted into her marriage registration folder. The tactical architecture of their deception was remarkably transparent, relying on an initial layer of administrative routine to camouflage an aggressive financial seizure. They had completely miscalculated her capacity for data verification. They assumed that the traditional authority of the Radcliffe name would blind her to the statutory contradictions embedded within the boilerplate paragraphs. The sudden appearance of Arthur beside the mahogany sideboard marked the transition from passive domestic pressure to active economic coercion. His shoulders were rigid under his dark wool sweater. They were operating under the extreme stress of impending corporate insolvency. They were driven by the knowledge that their family manufacturing assets would face immediate liquidation without the injection of a clean, high-value proprietary biological sequence. The prenuptial parameters they had explicitly signed were now being targeted by a fraudulent secondary instrument. It was an artificial debt device designed to break her legal resistance. Victoria leaned forward slightly, the amber light catching the sharp lines of her face, as she broke the silence with a flat, metered delivery that carried no trace of maternal warmth. Arthur stepped directly into the light, holding a notarized log sheet that supposedly documented an unauthorized extraction of proprietary database assets from the central server of Radcliffe Laboratories. He claimed that the preliminary analysis of her independent clinical trials constituted an explicit breach of their trade secret protections. He attempted to establish a clear statutory violation under the terms of the overlay document. The older woman tapped her finger firmly against the cream paper. She stated that the corporate board had already formalized an immediate, one-time punitive assessment based on a calculated multiplier of 5 times the baseline raw sample valuation. Clara listened as Victoria stated the metrics out loud. The older woman explained that the raw clinical data valuation of $115,000 had been multiplied by 5 to generate a final liquidated liability of $575,000. The text of the ultimatum was unyielding. She must execute a comprehensive transfer of her entire therapeutic patent portfolio to Richard Radcliffe before sunrise, or the family would submit the criminal complaint to the federal prosecutor. Her breathing remained steady, and her pulse was unchanged. She carefully noted the subtle micro-tremors in Arthur's fingers while he held the fraudulent log sheet. The execution of their financial trap reached its peak as Victoria pushed a heavy black fountain pen toward Clara, her hand maintaining a fixed position over the document to prevent any physical withdrawal. The system of leverage they were attempting to deploy was a direct violation of the Economic Espionage Act under Title 18. It was an explicit pattern of wire fraud and identity framing designed to bypass federal asset protection frameworks. Arthur stepped closer to the desk. His voice dropped into a low, calculated register as he warned her that a federal indictment would permanently terminate her standing within the Biogen research group. Clara reached out her right hand with deliberate slowness. Her fingers wrapped around the cold barrel of the pen, while her eyes remained locked on the exact line where her signature was required. Instead of signing the form, she pulled the document 2 inches closer to her side. Her analytical training allowed her to catalog the specific administrative discrepancies, including the invalid registration number of the deceased notary. She knew that the entire $575,000 contract structure was a legal fiction. It was an inflated instrument that could not survive a formal forensic audit by the Department of Justice. The terminal velocity of their corporate scheme was accelerating rapidly. However, They had failed to realize that by presenting a fraudulent demand exceeding the statutory limits of $550,000, they had officially triggered the high-severity federal sentencing guidelines against themselves. The ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner of the study seemed to amplify as Clara laid the pen down on the flat surface of the mahogany desk, completely untouched. The heat from the brick fireplace continued to press against the back of her shoulders. Her hands, however, had grown cold and completely detached from the emotional narrative of family loyalty Arthur was attempting to project. Through the glass panels of the office door, the grand staircase of the Radcliffe mansion sat in total darkness. It stood as a silent monument to an outdated hierarchy that had relied on appearances to mask structural decay. There were no additional verbal arguments from Victoria, and no further explanations came from her husband, as they realized the threat of the $575,000 liability had failed to produce compliance. Clara rose calmly from the high-backed chair. Her movement was fluid, measured, and entirely independent of the physical parameters they had attempted to impose on her life. The silence that filled the room was absolute. It was a heavy, unyielding space that marked the permanent fracture of their marital arrangement and the absolute beginning of her legal autonomy. She turned away from the cream-colored documents, stepping toward the exit as the orange light of the desk lamp faded behind her into the long shadows of the hall. The mechanical friction of the heavy security latch slipping into its metallic housing vibrated through the rubberized coating of Clara Vance's industrial safety shoes, signaling the absolute sealing of the inner bay. Her left shoulder leaned heavily against the cold, vertical frame of the cleanroom airlock, feeling the faint, rhythmic vibrations of the high-performance sub-basement centrifugal pumps below the floor plates. The local atmosphere within the interior perimeter of the analytical suite was precisely regulated to 19 degrees Celsius. However, the lingering dry cold from the midnight Cambridge rain seemed to cling to the microfibers of her protective head covering. A sharp, stinging sensation persisted beneath her right thumbnail, where the coarse edges of the Radcliffe legal document had split the skin during the forced signing ceremony hours before. The ambient air carried the unmistakable, clinical dry scent of cleanroom ventilation fluid, combined with the subtle, sweet undertone of circulating cooling oil from the nearby server cabinets. The overhead fluorescent fixtures had been extinguished for the night cycle, leaving only the shadowless, liquid luminescence of the massive triple monitor array to illuminate her face. Clara raised her right arm with calculated, agonizing slowness. Her gloved fingers extended toward the soft-touch interface button of the main sequence analyzer. Her breathing was completely leveled as she maintained a fixed, unblinking focus on the blank database directory. This technical isolation served as the perfect structural shield against the lingering psychological echo of Richard Radcliffe's triumphant laughter when the document was finalized. Clara scrutinized the terminal dashboard carefully. Her analytical mind dissolved the artificial victory her husband's family believed they had secured through the $575,000 contract threat. The family had operated under the classic bossy illusion that legal coercion could successfully substitute for actual scientific understanding. They assumed that the physical possession of her raw sequence files was equivalent to control over the underlying biological logic. Richard had displayed all the classic physical manifestations of an eye-killy personality during the confrontation. His posture was overextended, and his tone dripped with paternalistic condescension as he claimed credit for protecting the laboratory legacy. They were far too intellectually limited to anticipate the structural redirection she was preparing to implement. They saw a static asset to be sold, whereas she understood the genetic sequence as a dynamic operating system that could be recalibrated to destroy its own commercial value. Her prenuptial parameters remained technically uncompromised because the document they had forced her to sign would be rendered legally void by the very fraud they used to obtain it. She sat perfectly still in the ergonomic chair, her eyes reflecting the complex cascade of code lines as she prepared to integrate the subsurface error injection script. The digital clock in the lower corner of the screen advanced to exactly 2 hours after midnight as Clara opened the core database terminal. Her fingers executed the initial sequence commands without a single physical microtremor. The final sentence Victoria Radcliffe had whispered during the signing ceremony remained logged in her memory. It was a desperate command masquerading as a maternal blessing regarding the absolute necessity of sacrificial obedience. Arthur had stood directly behind his mother. His eyes shifted completely away from Clara's face, while he maintained a calculated silence that confirmed his direct participation in the transfer of the stolen files. Clara had intentionally kept her posture loose, her face completely devoid of any emotional registers as she signed the transfer forms. She noted the sudden relaxation in her husband's chest when the pen left the line. The family had completely miscalculated the fundamental laws of biochemistry. They assumed that copying the string of letters would grant them the functional utility of the $300,000 therapeutic compound. They were so blinded by the immediate prospect of the Zurich integration capital that they failed to realize her consent was a tactical maneuver designed to establish an absolute record of criminal exploitation. Clara deliberately engaged the system administrator protocol. Her voice remained low and steady as she spoke the authentication phrase into the terminal microphone to unlock the master database layer. The execution of the counterstrike began with the silent deployment of a digital bio-watermarking script. This advanced algorithmic signature embedded her original maiden name directly into the non-coding structural framework of the protein model. This hidden identifier was programmed to act as a permanent cryptographic token under Title 18, establishing irrefutable electronic proof of ownership that no subsequent database modification by Richard could erase. Her fingers moved across the mechanical layout with fluid precision, injecting a microscopic recessive substitution into the crucial third peptide linkage zone of the therapeutic sequence. This artificial modification was technically invisible to standard laboratory diagnostic utilities, passing every baseline validation run with the appearance of absolute structural stability. However, the hidden variable was designed to experience a catastrophic structural collapse the moment the sequence was subjected to the high-velocity simulation models required for industrial manufacturing scaling. The terminal interface blinked once in confirmation. The progress line indicated the complete assimilation of the error script into the main file package that Richard had already scheduled for mirror transmission to the Swiss syndicate. The trap was technically sealed, not through emotional retaliation, but through the flawless implementation of an engineering law that converted their stolen property into an immediate corporate liability. The glowing cyan visualization of the macromolecular tree slowly faded from the screen, leaving the analytical bay in the cold, shadowless dark of the subterranean research complex. The internal temperature of the main processing cluster stabilized rapidly, the cooling fans decreasing their velocity until the ambient sound of the laboratory returned to a low, uniform hum. Through the reinforced observation window of the security door, the long, linoleum-lined corridors of the Cambridge Center stretched out into the darkness. The hallway was completely devoid of security personnel or late-night staff. There were no additional administrative files to review, no remaining legal documents to sign, and no further domestic interactions to endure within the perimeter of this secure workspace. Clara stood up from the analytical console slowly. Her movements were measured, independent, and completely insulated from the structural weight of the Radcliffe family expectations. The quiet that occupied the laboratory was massive and absolute. It represented a definitive shift in the control parameters of her career and the total establishment of her professional freedom. She stepped away from the dark monitor arrays, entering the airlock corridor as the automatic systems engaged the primary pressure seals behind her back. The humid, cloying scent of melted paraffin wax from 200 catering candles drifted through the grand ballroom of the five-star Boston hotel, settling heavily against Clara Vance's face like a damp veil. Her right index finger dragged slowly along the gold leaf molding of the perimeter wainscoting, collecting a microscopic film of gray dust and the oily residue of aerosol fragrance sprayed hours prior. The ambient temperature beneath the three massive crystal chandeliers was maintained at 24 degrees Celsius by the forced air units, creating a stifling pocket of heat that caused the skin over her temples to prickle with perspiration. A rhythmic, low-frequency vibration rattled the floorboards under the soles of her satin evening shoes. It was a dull throb produced by 100 simultaneous conversations and the deep bass of the media setup at the front podium. The collective glare of 40 synchronized electronic flashes cast sharp, colorless starbursts across the white linen tablecloths, bouncing off the polished silver cutlery and burning the periphery of her vision with temporary blind spots. Clara held her posture rigid. Her spine was pressed flat against the velvet-cushioned wall panel, keeping her left hand hidden inside the pocket of her dress, while her eyes tracked the slow movement of the Swiss executives as they opened their secure leather presentation folders. Her chin remained level, her breathing rhythmic, regular, and entirely detached from the manufactured celebration expanding around her. This crowded grandeur was the artificial peak of the corporate deception that Victoria Radcliffe had spent the last 14 days broadcasting to the regional biotechnology sector. Clara analyzed the theatrical distribution of the room carefully. Her inner logic systematically broke down the unstable foundation of the $575,000 contract trap her husband's family had tried to spring on her career. The family had functioned under the traditional illusion that high society prestige could neutralize the structural rot of their operational balance sheet. They believed that a grand merger announcement would mask the systematic theft of her proprietary research. Arthur Radcliffe stood near the main projection array. His shoulders were tight beneath his formal black suit jacket, and his jaw clenched every time a television reporter pointed a microphone toward his mother. They had completely miscalculated the analytical depth of the Zurich Pharmaceutical Syndicate. They assumed that international investors would accept notarized data tables without running their own validation protocols on the digital sequence. The sudden arrival of 3 compliance officers from the Swiss firm marked the invisible transition from corporate triumph to immediate federal investigation. Their faces were frozen into identical masks of administrative hostility. The fraudulent secondary instrument the family had manufactured was about to enter a high-velocity processing system that would dismantle their dynasty before the scheduled dinner was served. Victoria stepped onto the raised stage slowly, her voice amplified by the dual-channel microphone setup as she delivered a calculated statement regarding the multi-generational continuity of Radcliffe Laboratories. Arthur stood exactly 3 feet behind her. His fingers curled tightly around the edge of the wood podium, while he maintained a rigid smile designed to project absolute commercial stability to the bank representatives in the first row. The older woman gestured toward the massive video wall, announcing that the integration agreement would finalize a $575,000 initial capitalization phase based on their newly acquired genetic therapeutic patent. The text on the main display listed Clara as a supporting shareholder who had voluntarily surrendered her individual development rights. This was a legal fiction that Victoria had validated using the forged signatures from the marriage registration folder. Clara listened quietly from the back of the room. She noted the distinct somatic indicators of panic in her husband's breathing as he glanced repeatedly toward the secure terminal where the Swiss technical team was initiating the final data ingestion. The clinical reality of Title 18 was already operating within the space. By submitting a stolen biological sequence across international communication networks for commercial gain, the family had officially established the statutory metrics of a major economic espionage campaign. The mechanical execution of her hidden script reached its definitive climax as the head of the Zurich technical division pressed the confirmation key on the verification console, sending the raw file package into their automated simulation cluster. The processing system was programmed to subject the base pair sequence to a high-velocity industrial scaling test. This was a rigorous stress model designed to simulate mass production under extreme biological pressure. Within 45 seconds, the smooth progress bar on the massive projection wall froze at exactly 72%. The interface was replaced by a flashing matrix of bright amber system warnings that caught the immediate attention of the lead developer. The screen automatically displayed a critical structure alert, exposing a fatal amino acid mismatch in the third peptide linkage zone that completely corrupted the therapeutic stability of the protein model. The automated verification system flagged the file as a fabricated asset. The alert highlighted the embedded digital bio-watermark that carried Clara's maiden identity instead of the Radcliffe registration number. Victoria's voice caught sharply in her throat. It was a dry gasp that was immediately swallowed by the sudden murmur of confusion rippling through the 200 investors as the system locked itself down. Arthur lunged toward the technical desk, his hands striking the edge of the monitor casing, while the Swiss compliance director stood up and ordered his security detail to preserve the terminal logs. The brilliant white light of the media flashes suddenly felt fractured. The celebratory mood was replaced by the chaotic movement of reporters scrambling toward the exit as the rumors of a federal intervention expanded through the room. The heat from the projection lamps seemed to double against the fabric of Clara's evening dress. Her hands, however, remained cold and entirely insulated from the physical collapse of the Radcliffe family structure that was unfolding on the stage. Through the wide glass doors of the ballroom foyer, 4 plainclothes agents from the Department of Justice stepped into the light. Their gold badges reflected the dim spider illumination of the hallway as they served the emergency freeze orders to the corporate officers. There were no additional announcements from Victoria, and no further explanations came from her husband, as they were surrounded by the shouting of investors demanding the immediate return of their partnership deposits. The silence that occupied Clara's internal space was absolute and clean. It was a massive barrier that marked the total termination of her marital obligation and the complete restoration of her professional autonomy. She stepped away from the velvet wall panel smoothly, navigating the perimeter of the panicked crowd as the automated security alarms began to drone throughout the hotel complex, leaving the ruined portrait of the family behind her in the dark. The concentrated smell of ethylene oxide sterilizer drifted through the intake vents of the airlock, scratching the dry tissue at the back of Clara Vance's throat with a cold chemical sting. Her right fingertips pressed lightly against the triple-layered quartz viewing pane, registering the intense vibration of the secondary exhaust turbines operating beneath the floor grid. The ambient temperature within the interior boundary of the containment suite was fixed at exactly 18 degrees Celsius. Yet the dull winter sunset bleeding through the narrow security slit cast a blood-red light that felt heavy against her eyes. A sharp, burning discomfort persisted along the outer margin of her wrist. The irritation was caused by the rigid plastic edge of her laboratory identification badge, which had chafed the skin during her previous 12-hour monitoring rotation. The local atmosphere carried the faint, metallic scent of ionized copper plating, mixed with the stale undertone of recirculated air from the main terminal bay. The exterior daylight was dying rapidly over the Cambridge skyline, casting a crimson stripe across the linoleum floor that created a literal barrier between her workspace and the two figures standing in the reception hall. Clara held her head perfectly steady. Her lungs expanded in slow, unvarying cycles that did not cause her silver necklace to click against the glass pane. Her eyes tracked the physical movement of Victoria Radcliffe as the older woman adjusted her unbuttoned winter coat with pale, trembling fingers. This sterile glass boundary served as a complete structural shield against the emotional leverage that her husband's family was desperately attempting to deploy across the communications intercom. Clara evaluated the collapsed state of the two individuals standing before her. Her inner logic systematically filed away the fractured domestic narrative they were presenting through their tears. The family had functioned under the foolish illusion that traditional blood obligations could automatically neutralize a federal criminal seizure. They assumed that a display of maternal distress would convince her to compromise her corporate standing. Arthur Radcliffe stood exactly 4 inches behind his mother. His shoulders were slumping heavily beneath his unpressed white shirt, and his chest heaved irregularly as he stared at the security intercom console. They were suffering the immediate physiological shock of a total corporate asset forfeiture. They were driven directly to her laboratory because the Federal Bureau of Investigation had frozen their operational liquidity. The $575,000 phantom debt instrument they had engineered was now functioning as a federal anchor. The charge dragged their remaining assets into a comprehensive grand jury investigation under Title 18. Their presence in the facility was not an act of reconciliation. It was a tactical deployment of domestic manipulation designed to extract a fraudulent technical amendment before the morning court session. Clara sat completely motionless behind the protective glass, her mind assembling the network timestamps that would permanently dismantle their defensive arguments. Victoria leaned toward the speaker mesh heavily, her voice cracking into an uncharacteristic, high-pitched register as she pleaded for a temporary technical statement to submit to the Swiss syndicate. Arthur stepped directly into the narrow path of the red sunset. His eyes tracked the motion of Clara's lips while he began an explicit appeal to their shared marital history to break her professional silence. The older woman stated that the entire future of Radcliffe Laboratories depended completely on a single document. She needed a mutual declaration admitting that administrative errors had occurred during the initial data upload phase. She explained that if Clara signed the temporary variance form, the European bank would release their frozen capitalization funds. This would allow the family to satisfy the immediate payroll debts. Arthur added that they were not asking her to validate the $575,000 contract structure. They simply wanted her to grant them the administrative flexibility to re-verify the base pair sequence. Clara pressed the intercom toggle with a slow, deliberate movement of her thumb. Her voice maintained an absolute technical flatline as she read the direct system log entries into the microphone. She informed them that the server records documented 6 independent administrative logins under Arthur's private credential. This was followed by 2 separate file uploads executed through Victoria's secure workstation. The somatic reaction was instantaneous. Her husband's breathing caught in his throat, his face flushing crimson under the shadow of the quartz panel. The mechanical progression of her refusal reached its final stage as Victoria pulled a crumpled set of settlement releases from her leather handbag, pressing the damp paper directly against the glass pane. The legal fiction they were attempting to implement was a desperate violation of federal criminal procedure. It was an explicit effort to suborn perjury to shield Richard Radcliffe from the severe penalties of the Economic Espionage Act. Arthur moved closer to the microphone unit. His words accelerated into a disordered pattern of empty promises and warnings regarding the permanent destruction of the family name on the regional exchange. Clara did not look at the signature lines on the paper. Her focus remained fixed entirely on the specific administrative access logs that detailed the exact hours their domestic fraud had been executed. She explained that the corporate accounts were completely locked under a federal restraining order. This was an unyielding statutory mechanism that prohibited any private modification of the contested patent assets. The terminal balance of their deception had been registered by the Food and Drug Administration Criminal Division. No private agreement could alter the empirical reality of the forged signatures. She reminded them that under the Fifth Amendment protections, she had no legal obligation to salvage an enterprise built on wire fraud. She would not attach her personal identity to an artificial resolution. Arthur's hands struck the metallic frame of the window box, his voice dying out completely as the security detail entered the far side of the reception corridor. The red light of the winter sunset finally dropped below the concrete horizon, leaving the sills of the security slit in the deep, uniform shadow of the evening. The air inside the cleanroom suite remained perfectly chilled. The emotional tension that had occupied the reception space was completely dissolved by the formal arrival of the federal marshals. Through the triple-pane glass, the silhouettes of Victoria and Arthur were escorted firmly toward the main elevator bank. Their physical movements were slow, hesitant, and entirely controlled by the strict parameters of the law. There were no additional verbal appeals from her husband's family, and no further interactions remained to be endured within the perimeter of this secure biotechnology center. Clara released the intercom switch slowly. The sudden absence of their desperate voices brought a profound, heavy quiet back into the analytical bay. The stillness of the laboratory terminals was massive and absolute. It marked the definitive boundary of her independence and the total collapse of their domestic authority. She stood up from the console, turning her back on the dark reception glass as she stepped into the primary cleanroom bay, leaving the remnants of the Radcliffe name behind in the darkness. The sharp dawn illumination of the new Cambridge Central Laboratory cut through the expansive glass perimeter, hitting Clara Vance's face with a cold, pristine clarity that cast no industrial shadows. Her left finger slid slowly along the smooth composite edge of the newly installed molecular fractionation console, catching the microscopic coldness of polished polymer plates and the absolute absence of chemical residue. The internal temperature within the main research bay was fixed at exactly 19 degrees Celsius, creating a stable, crisp layer of air that caused the slight irritation on her palms from months of legal documentation to completely disappear. A faint, rhythmic hum vibrated through the floor plates beneath her leather footwear, a gentle mechanical synchronization generated by 40 independent liquid chromatography columns operating in perfect baseline equilibrium. The ambient atmosphere carried the clean, subtle scent of sterilized silicon tubes, combined with the crisp, dry undertone of circulating liquid nitrogen lines powering the mass spectrometers in the adjacent sector. The clear winter sunlight was expanding rapidly over the horizon, throwing long, geometric shafts of amber light across the linoleum surface that highlighted the precise, automated movements of the sample robotic arms. Clara held her spine perfectly straight, her chest moving in slow, measured intervals that maintained an absolute physical stillness within the workspace. This technical stability served as the ultimate physical manifestation of the permanent separation she had achieved after 11 months of intense federal litigation. Clara monitored the operational charts on the primary display panel, her analytical mind systematically logging the structural liquidation metrics of the Radcliffe corporate framework that the Department of Justice had recently finalized. The complete erasure of Radcliffe Laboratories from the NASDAQ Exchange Index was not merely a commercial failure. It represented the total mechanics of a judicial liquidation that had dismantled their multi-generational influence. Arthur Radcliffe and Victoria Radcliffe had discovered that traditional social reputation was an ineffective shield against a federal bankruptcy petition, finding their family estate seized to satisfy the massive restitution liabilities ordered by the court. Richard Radcliffe was currently serving a 96-month sentence within a high-security federal penitentiary, his physical isolation the direct statutory consequence of executing a targeted economic espionage campaign under Title 18. Their systematic collapse had proceeded according to the unyielding laws of financial accountability, completely independent of the emotional manipulation they had previously deployed to capture her independent therapeutic research. She sat with absolute stillness behind the central console, her face completely empty of emotional registers, as the terminal confirmed the absolute validation of her clean patent assets. The formal decree from the United States District Court sat displayed on the secondary terminal panel, its text declaring the absolute rescission of contract due to fraudulent inducement, without a single administrative loophole remaining. Clara reviewed the technical definitions within the judicial order, noting the explicit language that invalidated every secondary instrument the family had manufactured through identity theft and forged signatures. The legal reality was comprehensive. The court had ruled that the $575,000 phantom debt overlay was entirely void from its inception, stripping the Radcliffe corporate estate of any residual interest in her peptide research. Her promotion to Director of Clinical Toxicology Research was formalized by an independent endowment board, granting her absolute executive authority over a private research fund exceeding $750,000. The defense counsels who had tried to corner her with settlement releases during the initial grand jury investigation had been completely excluded from the new residential perimeter of her laboratory. Clara touched the screen interface with a slow, deliberate motion of her index finger, activating the new network security layers that required direct, multi-factor biometric validation to access the genetic repositories. The somatic response within her environment was clean. The automated servers registered her new credentials instantly, locking the historical access logs away from any future corporate interference. The mechanical sequence of her final separation began. As Clara reached toward the side slot of the master control dock, her movements metered, fluid, and entirely free of hesitation. Her gloved thumb pressed the manual release button of the secondary reader unit, causing the obsolete proximity card bearing the Radcliffe Laboratories emblem to eject with a sharp click from the housing slot. She lifted the plastic token between two fingers, her gaze remaining fixed on the industrial shredder unit that sat integrated beneath the stainless steel framework of the central desk. Without a single backward glance, she dropped the card directly into the high-security disposal slot, listening to the instantaneous grinding of the steel blades as they reduced the final physical link of her marriage to microscopic fragments of carbon composite. Her right hand moved immediately toward the main isolation switch on the wall, her fingers engaging the mechanical lever with a firm, downward pressure that permanently deactivated the legacy communication channels linking her database to the old estate servers. The terminal arrays responded with a uniform sequence of system shutdown logs, their cooling fans decreasing their velocity in a steady deceleration pattern that signaled the absolute end of the Radcliffe parameters within her cleanroom suite. The final visualization of the molecular separation sequence reached completion on the central monitor, leaving the main laboratory sector in the brilliant, shadowless glare of the mid-morning winter sun. The air within the containment facility remained perfectly balanced, but the heavy historical pressure that had occupied her professional life for 3 years was entirely gone, replaced by the deep quiet of independent operation. Through the thick glass panes of the exterior wall, the freezing winds of the Cambridge harbor were throwing dry sleet against the insulated structure, but the internal systems maintained an absolute equilibrium that felt completely untouchable. Clara stood alone before the console, her hands resting flat against the clean metal edge of the station, while the low hum of the processing units faded away into the background, leaving the space in absolute silence. The freedom that occupied her laboratory was massive and definitive, marking the permanent establishment of her autonomy and the complete restoration of her genetic identity. She turned her face toward the expansive horizon, speaking the final confirmation phrase directly into the system archive interface to seal the new operational paradigm. I have redefined the metrics of my own genetic heritage, and the system now operates under my parameters.